The English portion of the ACT will test that you use correct punctuation marks within sentences on the test. In this lesson, we'll briefly review the types of punctuation and uses. The first punctuation that we're going to review here for the ACT is going to be commas. A very common punctuation, also one that a lot of students sometimes misplace. It'll show up numerous times on the exam. So what is their purpose? First of all, they set off independent clauses. Next, you use a comma to go ahead and divide up things in a series. You'll also use them to coordinate adjectives, and they're used for parenthetical expressions. There's an example of one here. The singer, for example, is important to the success of the show. If we take that for example, parenthetical expression, put it in parentheses. If you cross that out, it does not change the purpose of that sentence at all. It still has the same thing. The singer is important to the success of the show. The meaning stays the same when you get rid of parenthetical expressions. Let's continue. The next punctuation we'll take a look at is the semicolon. What they do, they connect two independent clauses not linked by a coordinating conjunction. What do we mean there? Let's look at an example that'll help us out. Some people prefer to play baseball. Others prefer football. Two independent clauses. What that means, we have this first part. Some people prefer to play baseball can stand alone. It is an independent. Others prefer football. Same thing. We have our subject and a verb. So between those two, you can put a semicolon in between them to set them off. There are three or more items in a series that contain commas themselves. That's another situation where you're going to need to use a semicolon. We have an example here. The officers elected for student council were Roy Shapiro, president, Mary Taylor, vice president, June Simmons, treasurer, and Joe Ward, secretary. So after each of those second things that are separated by a comma, you have your semicolon. After president, after vice president, after treasurer. That's where you're going to see semicolons. I'd like to go ahead and take a look again, looking at connecting two independent clauses. You're going to find that on the test numerous times, and sometimes they're going to be joined by a comma. We'll cover that in another chapter, but that situation is where you're getting into what's called a comma splice, and you have run-on sentences. So I want to talk about that. Most of the time you wouldn't use a semicolon there, you would separate the two sentences. In our short example, though, it makes sense. Another punctuation mark that you're probably going to find is a hyphen. When do you use a hyphen? That's the one that looks like a minus sign. Well, you can do that to divide syllables at the end of a line. And you also use a hyphen to join two or more words, serving as a single adjective before a noun. Here's an example. You have two or more words serving as an adjective, a one-way street. Those two words together are the description of the street, that kind. So you do have a hyphen in between. Chocolate-covered raisins. Both of those are just used as one single adjective. What kind of raisins? The chocolate-covered ones. By themselves, it wouldn't make sense. Chocolate raisins, that changes the meaning completely. The raisins aren't made of chocolate, they're covered. If you say covered raisins, what kind of covering? So chocolate covered go together as one adjective. So you'd use a hyphen in that situation. Now, when compound modifiers come after a noun, they're not hyphenated. So the peanuts were chocolate covered. Once again, you have chocolate covered raisins. You did use a hyphen in this one, but you would not here because they came after the noun. So that's one of those rules you want to keep into your mind. The cyclist was well known. Okay, and if it was the well-known cyclist going before the word cyclist, you would have a hyphen. In this situation, you do not have a hyphen in between those because it comes after the noun. So positioning matters when you're talking about hyphens. The next punctuation we're going to take a look at are apostrophes. Two common uses of apostrophes. One is to indicate possession. Whose is it? It is Mary's, apostrophe S. Bill's, apostrophe S. Or whenever numbers or letters are omitted. Okay, so these are your contractions, ones that you're familiar with. For example, the word don't. All right, made up of two words, do not. We're missing the O in between, so you would have your apostrophe there. So you go ahead and look for where that missing letter is, and that's where you put your apostrophe. Pretty simple. Been using those for, I'm sure, years and years. Occasionally, though, especially with possession, I do see some errors coming from students that should know better. So just keep it in mind. If there's possession, use that apostrophe. And if something is omitted, a letter, go ahead and put an apostrophe in there too. The next punctuation we'll take a look at is a dash. Okay, when would you use a dash? And you have an example of dashes there right after the word dash. It's to enclose information within a sentence in a way more forceful than a parentheses. It highlights the ideas and items enclosed. For example, you are the girl, the only girl, who ever broke my heart. They want to stress the idea that it's the only girl. So for this situation, we already talked about parenthetical expressions a little earlier where you would put commas around them. You have to take into account the meaning of the phrase in between. Should it be emphasized? And if it should, then you want to go ahead and use dashes. It's not that common, but you may find an example or so on the ACT exam. Other punctuation marks, now we're getting into the end of sentences, ones that I'm sure you're familiar with. Certainly just double check when they're giving you answers that you're not only choosing the word choice, but you're also choosing the punctuation. So you may get it down to the right word choice, and absentmindedly just go ahead and say, oh, okay, that's the right word choice, circle that one. But you've got to make sure that they're using the correct punctuation at the end of that word choice too. So don't necessarily stop right away on the English test when you assume you have it. Double check and make sure that there isn't a change in punctuations. That's where these come in. Certainly question marks are at the end of questions. Exclamation points used to show strong feeling. Quotation marks, okay, verbatim dialogue, meaning word for word. If somebody is being quoted, quotation mark, or you're taking their words and putting in exactly the way they said it, it has to be around quotation marks. And then you have the parentheses, which sets off secondary explanations. They can be removed without changing the meaning of a sentence. We had that example earlier, and those are sometimes they're in parentheses. Other times you'll find a comma before and after them. Both of them are acceptable. Pay close attention, not only to the underlined words given as choices on the ACT, but also to the punctuation choices as well. The answer choices may be checking both that you choose the proper word from a list, but also the correct punctuation.